Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Oh, so exciting to have someone special that we will introduce in a second. But good afternoon, dear friends in learning. How are we all today?
Oh, yeah, it's a good day today.
I'm good.
A good day.
Welcome to week 2 of our deep dive learning lab. This week we're focusing on formative assessment. We have Jim and Summer and Chris. Chris not quite on screen yet, but coming very soon. And this week we have a special guest, Tom Barrett, who's going to support the team and talk to you about formative assessment in an online environment. We had a little preview last night. It's a good night for everyone. So hand over to you, Summer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Karen. And thanks, Tom, for being here. We'll get to know you a little bit more in a second. So we are talking about reimagining assessment in that online environment today. I would love it if you put in the chat right now where it is that you're joining us from and say a little hello to everyone. So I would love to kick off to acknowledge that we are, as a presenting team, presenting on the lands of Wurundjeri people and pay our respects to elders of the Kulin Nation, past, present and emerging, and would also like to pay respects to Aboriginal lands that you are learning on today as well. All right, so to kick off, Chris is going to be joining us just a little bit later. We've got Jim here today. Jim is doing all sorts of amazing things with people all across the world in helping them in this online learning journey as well. Jim, I know that you were hanging out with some folks from the USA yesterday.
Yeah, I was working with teachers in New Hampshire, America.
Great.
You know, I don't even, did anybody really know where New Hampshire is? But but it was at 11 o'clock at night. So I actually finished my sessions around 1:30 in the morning. So,
Wow. Well, thank you for being here. We really appreciate that, Jim.
But it's the cool thing. Let me just say that it's the cool thing is that that's what this does. This online learning allows us to be anywhere and doing this at all times. So that's the exciting piece, isn't it?
It is cool. It's nice and seamless. I mean, we've said here as a bit of a joke, we're 1.5 meters away. We're 1.5, billion meters away, right? And it just normalizes that now the whole world is our staff room and we can kind of really get that online help that we need really quickly. But Jim, thank you for being here. Tom, my friend, good to see you. So excited that you're here. What's something that you've been doing this week?
Oh, thanks, Summer. Great to be here. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, great to join you in a session. Great to see all the kind of the schools and places that people are coming from, by the way, in the chat. It's fantastic. Something new this week. I've been working actually online with Adelaide Botanic High School, a brand new high school over in Adelaide. So supporting them in some online sessions and running some new courses for their leadership team over there. So that's been fun this week, Summer.
I love that. And I know that you've also, a lot of the things that we are looking at today, tried, tested and true in your work across the world and across Australia. So really excited about that as well. I want to kick into what we will actually be looking at in this particular masterclass or course. I mean, we've got 90 minutes here to really reconsider assessment, what it looks like, sounds like, and feels like. Now, we know that there are some challenges and opportunities in an online environment. Thinking about last week and our building blocks of learning, this is very much the next step. So in terms of our knowledge set, we're really having a look at mindsets around learning. We're having a look at the proxies, and we'll get a bit of a idea flurry, won't we, Tom, around what people are actually utilising and some of those strategies for, all importantly, the home campus. So in that mindset, we really want you to think about yourself as a learning designer, thinking around that difference between learning and performance, which we will dive a little bit deeper into. We will be stuffing that skill set and tool set full of some new tips and tricks today, but we're very much looking at the observation of the signals of learning, that how do we know beyond the professional judgment. And Tom's got some really great cues for us around how noise really fits into that. And I think you'll have some aha moments there. Importantly, the tool set today, we've got all of our usual Google tools there. We are going to be diving back into Miro as well, and some really great tips and tricks and tools, importantly, for solo taxonomy. So that's very much that knowledge set, mindset, skill set, tool set that you'll be walking away with today. So we are building upon what we have done last week. So if I can kick into a little bit around what it is that we value, and these are the ways that us as a facilitation team work, but also we would love for you to work under as well. Remembering that we're not striving for perfection, but we are actually striving to go forward in what it is that we are doing. So getting less wrong is in. We know that there's all sorts of answers. I'm going to put them in bunny ears, Jim and Tom, out there at the moment. But actually the answers are coming from testing, reflecting, embedding and making decisions around what works. But we do have those building blocks, and we'll talk about those in a second. Remembering as well, whatever we are learning and it is making a difference for students and your colleagues, share that and share it widely and loudly. So sharing learning is caring. You can do that through the Miro. We're seeing lots in Twitter. And of course, you can take any of these resources and push them out as well. So that's really what we value. Anything else that you wanted to add there, Tom or Jim?
I think for me, the getting less wrong is a fascinating one. I think one of the things we're looking at today is how do we know that learning is happening? And I think that's such a great kind of question to grapple with. And one of the things I think we've got to understand and be okay with is that it's complicated and it's messy, and we just need to try to be gradually less wrong each time. And seeking perfection is a great mindset to approach in terms of when we're sort of thinking about how do we understand, learning is actually taking place for every student. So I think it's great, the kind of set of ideas that you've got there.
Love it. And I will give you some more tangible ones, particularly about that value one in a second. But in terms of these building blocks, it's important to note that once again, all of this isn't separate from those great strategies and pieces that the department has available to you. We have worked into this course the great pieces out of the FISO framework. We've really looked at the high impact teaching strategies and of course embedded that process of the E5 in there as well. So we want you to know that anything here is really animating, amplifying and enabling those great strategies and frameworks as well. So a quick reminder where we are at on our journey. This is an online learning micro course, which is a 3-step process. Last week, we really had a look at what it's like to build an architecture of a learning experience. Today, really looking at that assessment piece, and going into next week, it's around enabling students to be partners in their learning. We know that was Gonski recommendation 1 or 2, I think, guys. And there's some really great ways that has been effectively done and evidence-based as well, particularly with our friends up in the Northern Territory. So we actually have a student executive leader in with us next week to run through what does that look like, sound like and feel like. So we're nearly there. We're kind of at that halfway point, nearly over. Can't cope with that too much. I really like these. But let's kick into those parameters that I want to remind you of. I know it's been a really big week. It feels like 200 years since we last met. You'll remember that we distilled a lot of that research and what we saw was going on in schools. Yes, David Cox loves a shout out to the Northern Territory as well. So parameter 1 was very much around the social emotional well-being of our school community. Parameter 2 is where we're looking at that continuity of learning on the home campus. Tom will really push our thinking around what is learning. So he's going to really be keeping that strong for us today. When we have a look at the 10 design principles, you'll know that last week we hit on 2. This week we're hitting on 3. So we know that there are 4 that currently sit in that well-being, social and emotional well-being of our school community, and that there are 6 that sit within continuity of learning on the home campus. Today, we are focusing in on design principle number 3. We're really thinking around that connection of, well, what's that relationship to the content? What's that relationship to the next step? What is the connection there between learner, teacher, content, and of course, that sense of how we know. So that being together, that connection to the purpose is really critical, right, Tom? The The second two that we want to make sure that we really hit on for you, because they're incredibly important, the transparency, the what, why, how, the things that are specific and measurable. We also want to think about what we can start to ditch. We love to say, what are we going to bin? What are we going to bring? And what are we going to begin? We should be looking at reflecting on that all the time. These guys know that I love a little bit of alliteration in that kind of way. Bin, bring, begin. Say that really fast. And our third design principle we're looking at today, the signals of growth. So really thinking around the reflection and the dialogue, and as Tom will point to us as well, are the proxies. So if we wanted to imagine this as kind of a schema for our very, very tired brains, we would look at, and I've grayed out the ones that we're not looking at today, but that fundamental foundation is connection. Then we go next into those building blocks, which is transparency and growth. So you're on the right one there, Jim. All good. So that's how we then start to conceptualize how this all starts to grow. All right, Tom, I'm going to kick over into a current assumption so that we can start to consider what this looks like today. The current assumption is this, that the purpose of assessment is to make learning growth visible. What say you, Tom Barrett?
Yeah, it's interesting as well. I suppose it's also, when we look at the opposite of this, is that sometimes things are invisible. You know, sometimes like Jim just disappeared. Yeah, so Jim is now invisible. He's gone behind the scenes to kind of support us, no doubt, and carry on his great work. But what we're saying here is that learning growth is sometimes tricky to spot, is sometimes, you know, the signals of it are tricky to understand, and also difficult to interpret. And so I think it's also interesting to sometimes look at the opposite of this and saying, you know, we're saying that assessment is, and the purpose of it is actually to make it visible. Well, then it's also assuming that there's sometimes it's invisible. It's like, it's a bit tricky to kind of understand. So I think that's an interesting way of sort of reflecting on it, is that all of the signals of learning growth are sometimes kind of hidden or masked to us, and we have to find and develop really good tools and strategies to kind of unmask them and make them more visible.
I love that that's not only a learning designer, but we're kind of like a learning archaeologist sometimes, right? We've got to actually kind of strip away some of the clues that have been put over the top that make us almost throw us off the scent of what learning might be. And I know you've got some thoughts on that as well. So if we have a look at some key assessment concepts here, we very much need to have a look at, you know, the emotion that is around that for teacher and learner. And we want to really have a look at this concept of a learning zone versus a performance zone. Too often we muddle those, and we've got a really clear kind of indicator that will have that aha moment of that as a concept that we can start to design deliberately into really good assessment, as well as the notion of emotion. So if I have a look at a very great quote by Helen Imordino-Yang, Helen says that traditional education approaches think about emotion in the way Descartes did. Emotion is interfering with your ability to do well in school and to think rationally. It's a really interesting one, isn't it? To do rationally, and yet we're too emotional, and yet we're always saying learning is relational. These are almost some mixed signals. But what's really nice about this is a quote, neuroscience is showing us that it is absolutely not the case. When you take the emotion out of thought, you have no basis for thought anymore. So we need to make sure that there is a very much a heart and a head concept that is deeply designed into assessment. It's that whole point of why we say, why would we bother doing this? Who cares? What's the point? Making that really, really clear and transparent. If we have a look at another big thinker, this is a TED Talk that will absolutely change your life. We love Eduardo Bracino. And what I really love is one of his core notions is this sense of real confidence is about modeling ongoing learning. So it's not about saying, oh, look, I've got everything perfect and right. It's actually about saying, actually, I have this ongoing learning, and I might stop at a period of time, and I might actually condense that and put that out into the world in a nice shiny box. but that can't be what I do all of the time. This is where we get that notion of the growth and the fixed mindset. And I know that's been bandied around, I'm probably going to say, Tom, this kind of idea of growth mindset. You chuck the word yet on the back of anything, it's a growth mindset. But actually what we're looking to do here is think about that in terms of a learning mindset and a performance mindset. Tom, you've watched this TED Talk. What was your one tweetable takeaway from that?
One of the things I think is interesting is thinking about the things that are my own experiences. And so I was just thinking now, as you were talking about something that I'm learning at the moment, is trying to learn how to play the piano. And I think there's a good distinction between I can kind of plinkety plonk away on my own when I'm in that learning zone and I feel fine. I'm kind of experimenting, I'm playing around. I might just sit there without anything. But as soon as somebody says, oh, can you play me something? Then I'm having to switch into the performance zone. And that, for me, I always find that really difficult, and everything changes. It's almost like the conditions for what I was doing have suddenly shifted as somebody's requested this sort of performance. And I think that for me, that sort of connection to a moment when I'm learning has sort of helped me understand that distinction between potentially what it feels like for our students to kind of notice the difference. The conditions are shifting when we're thinking about these two different zones. And so how do we, as designers of learning, pay attention to that? How do we kind of pay attention to what's going on for our students and really put ourselves in their shoes? And so being able to connect with your own learning is a great way to kind of think about that moment when someone goes, okay, show me, perform your latest tune, or, show me something that you've kind of learned. It suddenly just changes the conditions and changes the environment.
Oh, you couldn't be more spot on. And what I love about Eduardo's work is he really says that in order for us to design or understand or empathize with others, we need to do that hard work ourselves as well. And that is where the confidence in being a learner comes from. Good learning takes a good learner, you could say. So Tom, if we were to break this up a little bit more, we'd have a look then at this kind of distinction, I suppose, between a learning zone and a performance zone. So if I think around a goal in a learning zone, it might look like, and Jim, if you just kind of keep pumping those across, yeah, it would look like, I've got this goal and I'm able to improve. Where performance is actually, no, we've got to execute. We've got to do that best that we can. So, a learning zone is training. Performance zone is the game, we could really say. In terms of a learning zone, in terms of our focus, we might say, well, we've got a growth focus here that we want to be getting better and that we want to be improving. Whereas a performance zone actually says, no, this is a flawless execution. So we need to make sure that we iron all the bugs out or design those out and have it quite perfect. When we're considering this notion of failure in a learning zone, we quite like it. We actually expect it, and we use it to fail forward, to give us that next step. But if I'm in a performance zone mentally from a mindset, then failure starts to become something that is incredibly scary. And in fact, it's avoided at all costs. And it can often be sort of, ride or die. That's it. When we're in a performance zone. You can imagine a student in that zone, they'd almost be paralyzed to even take a first step of learning or performance at all. When we think of this perceived cost in a learning zone, this is a really interesting one. The perceived cost in a learning zone for us, it's a low stakes. And I love what you were saying, Tom. We actually have to consider the stakes involved, right? If I'm learning here, it's low stakes. It's me, it's familiar folks, it's not public, it's quiet, it's cheap, etc. In a performance zone, though, we know that quite often it's an incredibly high stakes concept. So the perception of that is really quite scary. It's almost like one of the.
Sorry, Summer, go on.
No, please.
I was just thinking how those descriptors are often used for assessment, aren't they? Of the things that we've seen so far, being able to we often say low stakes quizzes or low stakes assessment or high stakes assessment. We that's often a bit of language that we'll use when we're actually describing moments of assessment or, moments for a student to be able to show their achievement or their accomplishment.
You're spot on there. And I even look at something like just do the best you can is often a throwaway to our students. But that's actually somewhere in there, switching on a performance mindset rather than let's do this to see where we might improve going forward. So it's a great note to say this is almost used in our language daily. So in terms of experimentation as well, and we know a lot of schools do have a lot of design thinking, et cetera around that. So experimentation is quite big. A learning zone for experimentation, we might look at that as something that looks like, a constant. We're always experimenting. We're always trying new things. We're always pushing just a little bit further than we were before. So when we're starting to think around maker spaces, for example, as just a concrete, tangible way, they're not perfect creator spaces. It's meant to be tinkering, it's meant to be messy, and there's meant to be constant iteration. But that performance zone here, when we're thinking around experimentation, minimal. We probably wouldn't try anything new. We'd just be doing the same thing over and over. So can very quickly become a rut when we're in that performance zone. And finally, feedback. This is a really critical one, isn't it, Tom? So I might let you take learning and performance zone for feedback.
Yeah, sure. So Jim, pop those up on here. I was just interested also thinking about that constant experimentation, Summer, that you mentioned, and you quickly kind of talked about design thinking. And I think that helps, just that idea that experimentation is a disposition or is a mindset, also adds another way of describing mindset to our burgeoning kind of language set that we have when we talk about that. And so that's something that I would really encourage, is to think about what's a prototyping or an experimenting mindset like, and because it's closely associated with that learning zone in terms of how it's represented. I think that when we're talking about a learning zone and we're talking about the aspect of feedback, we're talking about feedback for learning. And so when you're in the zone, when you're in that particular moment where you're experimenting, where the stakes are low, where you're focused on growth, feedback is all about for learning. So, and we're saying here that we're welcoming it. So we welcome feedback in those moments. However, when you're in the performance zone, when you're shifting to something that's much more high stakes, suddenly your focus is shifting away from I'm trying to improve or grow. Instead, you're trying to flawlessly execute. Feedback is very much about judgment, and it also potentially the stress increases, doesn't it? When you kind of when you're sort of receiving feedback, when you're trying to flawlessly execute, feedback on that is a sort of a much more challenging. And so there's a big difference about how you might receive feedback when you're in those two different zones.
Very much so. And I think this as a reminder to stick up on our desks almost, to think, okay, what am I designing for? It's not to say that performance zone is worse than the learning zone, not at all. It's just saying, where do we want this to actually sit? Because sometimes we do want to be in that performance zone. What are the precursors to that? And how can we still make that a really powerful experience as well? So we know that one way. Oh, go on, please.
I was going to add in here, maybe there's also the assumption by maybe look at the sort of table here that you move from one to the other, or that there's just this, you're in there once and you're in the other side once. And I think there's something probably worth just breaking that down, saying those moments can be different. If you design something where there's more opportunities for performance zones, throughout a sequence of learning, not just at the end. We often kind of put the performance zone at the end of a unit, don't we? Right. It's a time to stand up and do your pitch, Well, what about smaller mini zones, that you kind of build in and sort of design into a sequence of learning, so that learners can move in and out of those zones and not just stay in one and kind of become stagnant and then have to move into the other. And the bridge between them then seems to be so big. And so maybe there's different ways we could think about moving learners into and out of those different zones. And I think it's probably worth just exploring that in our designs.
I love that so much. Kath has said here, less risk equals more learning. I think that's definitely true most of the time. We've got to say, though, there are some, elite athletes or elite learners that love that performance zone and actually take it as a learning experience as well. So again, it's contextual and it is emotional. we use proxies as a bit of an example of a key concept, though, Tom, and I think that it's incredibly important for us to be really clear on what we mean by a key proxy for learning. So what we're really thinking here is it's a way of showing, it's an example of, I think that we just had somebody else reappear. Chris Hart, you can't sneak up on us like that. How are you, my friend?
I'm really well, thanks, Summer. Really excited to be here. Sorry for being a little bit late. I was
That's all right. Just talking about proxies for learning. I know that's your jam as well.
I'm so excited. I was listening in the background for the last few minutes about how beautifully you explained learning zones and performance zones. And I just want to say hi to Kath Peters. Hi, Kath Peters, who's one of the nicest people in the world, who was one of the first people I ever met in Australia. So I'm so glad she's connected. Yes. I've just been with the Yarra Rangers Tech School doing some amazing, lots of fun design thinking. If you are not using your tech school and you've got one near you, make sure you get onto it because they're amazing.
Do it.
And I'm just going to listen for a little bit. And I know Tom's going to take us through this idea of what on earth a proxy is and really make it really clear to us so that we can make them better, I guess, and make really good ones.
Fantastic. We were just saying it's an example, right, Tom? So that's where I left off.
Yeah, so we were kind of we all use proxies all of the time. So this is not a particularly new thing. Maybe just give us a bit of a language to describe stuff that's happening in the classroom already. And so, like you said, Summer, a proxy for learning is just a way that we show what we know, or showing what the learning that we already have, or that we're developing, or that we're experiencing. And so think of it as a representation of learning. It's something that we're asking maybe our students to create. Is often an easy one. So filling in some sort of thought bubbles or speech bubbles to sort of show some different thoughts, filling in some sort of work, doing something online, creating a set of slides on, in a collaborative slideshow, whatever it might be, or putting things on Padlet, writing stuff down, recording themselves. Any of those are proxies. And so something to consider, though, is how accurate and how representative those proxies are of what our learners have learned. And so that's a really important distinction, is to say not every proxy that we get is going to be a really accurate representation. Some of those might show us other things that we weren't expecting. And so through our efforts around improving our learning design, we're trying to align the proxies that we ask our students to create and represent and use. We want to align that really, really clearly with our intentions.
And so the reason we need proxies, though, Tom, as we were saying, is like, if I could MRI scan every kid's brain while they were learning and see those areas flashing up as this beautiful GIF represents on the screen there, it's like, I think would probably be immoral. I'm sure you couldn't get the ethical clearance to MRI kids in class. But so what's the next best thing, right? What's the next best thing? What can we design to show that learning? I think that's a great explanation. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah. So, being able to, it's always going to be tricky to get, I think we sort of say closest to the synapse wins, like you try to get as close as you can to that kind of brain activity. And, one of the simplest things is actually just to get your students talking. And we know that we've got lots of opportunities to do that. Get them recording and capturing their thoughts. Talking out loud is often a bit of a direct line into what's going on. We've also got another example within which we want to share, which is a really practical way of actually using, and Chris and I and Summer, we all kind of use this strategy when we're working with others, when we're kind of when we're working in workshops with adults, but also it's a great thinking routine for students. And that's hexagonal thinking. And I know that I'm sure many of you have maybe explored this before, but it's such a simply resourced thinking routine that is a great proxy. So what we're saying here is that a student uses a hexagon. Maybe they write down, or they pick up from a set that's already created. They write their ideas down on those, and those are representative of their thinking, of their learning. They then place the hexagons down, and they're talking about them, moving them around. potentially thinking about the connections between them. And so as soon as our students start to explore the connections, we're starting to really see a much deeper, more conceptual level of understanding maybe about those ideas.
And I think that, Tom, the idea of, it was on that just first slide there, this idea of brains on the table, that comes from a piece of work. Yeah, thanks, Jim. That comes from a piece of work by Professor David Leet at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne around diagnostic and formative assessment. And literally, how do you get kids' brains out of their heads? That sounds gross, but out of their heads and onto the table so that's visible. And those of you who joined us last week, and we're going to do it again in a minute, we're going to use a Miro board as a kind of proxy ourselves. And it's very much that idea of we're going to get your brains and your thinking and your learning out of your heads and into this space. So just thinking about a proxy as, brains on the table, I guess. And I think we've got on that next slide, Jim, just after this one, I think we've got another example there. And this links to, we took this example from some resources that we've already shared with you, but this is in the Thinking Canvas resource, which we'll put a link to in the chat in case you've missed that previously, but just showing you how you can use things online, like, for example, Google Slides or Miro boards or Padlets or whatever you want to use to help kids to put their brains on the digital table. So we'll pop that in the chat in a second. Is there anything else you want to explain about hexagonal thinking, Tom?
I think there's a few things here that would be a proxy. First of all, maybe if the students create their own hexagons, which have got their ideas on them. So, that's one thing. The way that they've connected them and maybe annotated a little map, created it maybe on their own slide, is also another clear proxy or signal to us about the way that they are thinking and the way they're understanding. But I've always found that actually the talk over the top, the explanation and the description and the discussion that goes on as they build is also another great proxy for us. So there's a few layers there, but I would always encourage not just to look at the end result, like a finished map or a little hexagonal map, but also think about how you might ask your students to capture themselves talking, describing what they're doing as they're doing it, and then find that a way to grab that kind of audio file as well, and to kind of listen to the language that they use to in terms of how they articulate the connections.
Beautiful.
I love it. There are a couple of proxies, and you will understand these because we've been looking at these as variables, right, Chris? And I love how it's looking at this kind of variable tool for us to be making some of those decisions, not forgetting that we're looking at building assessment in line with online pedagogies as well. So can you talk us through how you would use this tool when we're thinking around assessment? Chris?
Absolutely, I can. I realized that my connection just dropped out again a little bit. So hopefully you can hear me okay.
We can.
Awesome. So welcome to online learning. Thanks, Telstra. Learning proxies, and this idea of, so the learning proxies we use often when we're in class is we're able to authenticate them. And by that, we're able to say, this child has done this thing, which demonstrates their learning because they did it in class with me. It might have been an exam or a test, or it might have been a piece of writing they've done or a piece of artwork they've done, but they've done it in conditions that I can authenticate. And we know that in terms of the kind of remote and flexible learning pedagogy is we can't now authenticate in any, I've seen examples and talked to friends who are teaching, who are doing SACs, and they literally have the webcam on the students doing a handwritten SAC for 3 hours. And you kind of think, well, it's okay, let's do that for now, but it's not really sustainable. And the capacity to authenticate in that way, or not have a parent like in the background holding up the answers on a piece of paper. So really, when we're thinking about authenticated assessment, maybe now isn't the time to overly worry about that. And one of the kind of tests for around authentication we can talk about is it is it a Googleable question I'm asking, or is it an unGoogleable question that I'm asking? Because in fact, if everything's Googleable, then it's really far too easy for us to copy and paste. We're teaching kids Command or Control-C, Control-V. So that whole piece around authentication is a really tricky one at the moment. It's a bit rogue. Accessing test conditions, so actually getting students in a space in their homes or in their home campus or wherever they are when they're learning, which is quiet, which is peaceful and focused, and they can do test conditions. We can't control that anymore. In our classrooms, we could do that, or we could bring students into the school hall and we could get them to be in test conditions there. And absolutely, young people need to be able to perform under test conditions, and we need to be able to be in the performance zone and all of those kind of things. But at the moment, it's a bit rogue. It's actually really hard to do. In terms of the standardized expectations, this idea that, as we've mentioned on numerous occasions and through the parameters and the design principles, that it ain't standard, right? Is when kids are in school, we're able to standardize a lot of things, so we're able to make sure they've got very similar experiences. At the moment, it's not the case. So again, it's rogue. And that idea of getting kids into a performance zone mindset is really, really difficult, really rogue. Because I mean, and the example I've used before is my own son, who's 15 in year 10. He is doing a lot of his learning from bed under his doona, and it's okay. I mean, we encourage him to come out into the light sometimes. I worry that he might, turn into dust and disappear. But he comes out and works at the dining table. But often he's not feeling like he's in that performance zone, and so it's a really interesting piece around mindset. So what about
sorry, Chris, I was just going to say, like, it just seems that our summative or our, even our higher states, but definitely those, higher decision tests or assessments, all of those variables become more rogue. But when we're looking at something that's a bit more formative, which sits back in that learning zone, possibly out of the performance zone, things start to become a little bit more controllable or designable, perhaps, when we are looking at online or remote learning as well.
And even more possible, because sometimes if we think about this idea that often now where we have to review, we have assessment cycles and things, and one of the things that I know Summer and I love to talk about is what you're going to bin, what's going, because we can't do it all, right? We can't manage to do it all. And I know that the frequency of assessment might be less, and I would always argue that's not a bad thing, because it does a number of things. By actually having a few less assessments allows us to really personalize those assessments. So we might think about when we're designing an assessment piece, or we're designing a proxy for learning, we're designing something that we want the students to create. We might say the content is fixed. You're doing photosynthesis, or you're doing area of a triangle, whatever it might be. The content's fixed. The process is, I'm going to give you some really rich input. You're going to practice some things. But really, the thing that you create to show your understanding, your proxy, maybe we can give kids choice over that. So if we think about content, process, and product, maybe the product is something that we can say, do whatever you want. If you want to create a video, if you want to create an infographic using Canva, if you want to create a mind map using some mind map software, or if you want to create a hand drawing, take a photograph of it. As long as you're meeting the criteria of demonstrating to me your understanding of the content, great, do whatever you want with it. So being able to actually personalize that a little bit more is, I think, quite exciting. Having more learning conversations, and we know that lots of people have moved to a more asynchronous model, where there are bigger chunks of asynchronous time, and actually using that time. And we know that there's an equity issue around access to technology. And sometimes so we can get on the phone, and a conversation is, ring up or organize the time to ring the parents and students and to have those conversations. Ideally, you want a kind of small group conversation. I always think is really rich. If you can do that on the Google Meet or on a WebEx, then brilliant. And then I think the kind of that third one around the time to act on feedback. We know that often one of the downfalls of feedback is you'll spend 75 hours putting marks on, marking a work and giving feedback on work for students, and then give it back to them and they go, oh, thanks, and then fold it up and put it away. And often it's because the actual feedback is coming too late, because we're already moving on to the next unit. And just coming back to what Tom talked about, is often we put that assessment piece, the performance piece, right at the end of a unit before we're going to move on. And so actually having more time to act on feedback. And and constantly saying we're all in the learning zone, not just the students, but indeed every single one of us is in the learning zone, and really emphasizing that right now.
I love this example of what we're starting to really, in a tangible way, mean by proxies. So, Jim, if we head on to the next slide, what we can start to see is a little bit of a continuum. When we're looking from the correct answer to what Chris was then saying into sort of my answer, we can see that there's actually some very familiar proxies to us. So a quiz or an exam, that's very much as right or wrong. You're going to get that right or wrong. Now, whatever the stakes are, it's still saying the proxy is this is right or wrong, correct answer. If we look at something that's a bit more responsive, we might have a proxy that's a mind map or a video or a written reflection. There's hundreds more, but we're just giving you this example of where they might sort of sit on that continuum. And over here in the my answer, that's where Chris was saying it's a learning conversation. It's a dialogue around process and product. We might even look at things like Flipgrid or a learning log. We might even look at some of that portfolio or project-based work as well. And again, that's very conversational even within it, isn't it, Chris? It feels like you can't just hand it, done, tick. It won't honour the process of it either. So we want to hear now what some of your proxies are. What are you using as proxies of learning? These are, again, the examples or ways that we might sort of learning might even take form. So we're going to head over to Miro now, our favourite brain on the
table. Brains on the screen.
Brains on the screen. And what we've got is a nice big yellow box there. You know what to do. Grab those Post-it notes. And you need to pop in what are your different proxies for learning. Flipgrid came up a lot yesterday, but there might be lots of different things that you do. We've got primary teachers, secondary teachers, all sorts in here. We'll give you, what do you reckon, Chris, about 5 minutes to pop on the screen all the proxies that you can?
Perfect.
5 minutes. Beautiful. We might even put a time.
Yep.
There you all are. Wonderful.
Oh, I'm in the wrong. Sorry, I'm in the wrong mirror. I'll just go into the right one now. Such a professional.
Just head into the right mirror. So just on that big yellow board there. Beautiful. I can see it starting to take shape. Fantastic.
And just let us know in the chat if there are any challenges getting in there. We can definitely help.
Even Miro itself, Chris, Tom, I know that you've been working with quite a lot of groups. I've been working with some students over the past couple of days, and it's very much that proxy for engagement, I think, in some of the work that we're doing. Miro gives us those little sparks of, folks are with us. They're putting their ideas down live as well. So it can be a nice little proxy to share.
So I'm going to try and just put a little bit of background music happening somewhere. So see if this works.
I love a bit of music.
I'm just going to maybe turn down the volume a bit. Oh, man, I stopped it. I was doing so well.
I like this as a little tool as well. It shows us on Miro you can put all sorts of things.
Let's try that again, so we'll make it work this time. Can you hear that coming through?
No, not yet.
Brilliant.
Tom, I know what I think is kind of interesting in our conversations we would have had, 10 years ago around learning spaces as a really incredible part of our learning design. And we would always say pedagogy comes first, the space needs to speak to the learning and what you want the learning to do. Similarly here with online course, right?
Is the music working now, just as you were all chatting?
Yeah, just as Sam was asking a boring question.
All right, great. Sorry.
This feels like it's the new learning space.
Yeah, I mean, we might consider they're fascinating, the digital spaces that we have, in our toolkit nowadays. And I think, we should definitely consider how do we augment and and supplement our physical spaces with really great digital spaces. And often, in many ways, our digital spaces have fewer constraints on us in terms of, like, look at this. I mean, there's like, you know, there's so many people working in the same space, all occupying that with their own ideas and able to read each other's, you know, and it's a great, it's always been a fascinating thing for me to see how we can connect ideas. It's like, it's a way of socializing our thinking and putting it out there in the world and for others to read it. It's not just a case of I'm going to put my idea out there and that's it. I'm actually, in the act of sharing, I'm able to potentially see 20 or 30 other ways of thinking about that same concept. And so, yes, the digital spaces have become incredibly rich and very, very powerful. And we should absolutely be thinking about ways to better integrate them, or also back into our physical spaces. You know, imagine this on a big screen, and, you know, in kind of hallways and breakout spaces, and, you know, lots of students spread out across 2 or 3 big home bases or wherever you're working. You know, when we're back together again, being able to kind of see kind of thinking and ideas being developed in digital spaces is always fascinating.
It makes it's just a really great point in those last couple of minutes as well, Tom, that the reality is, even when we're back together in school, we might have some operational constraints that won't allow big groups to be together. So how might we use that as a bit of a design or a tool or a practice question, utilizing things like big walls and projectors that we know we already have, and smaller bases of learners around, could be a really interesting way of keeping that connected learning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting to think about how we have so many choices nowadays within our schools and as teachers. I mean, there's so many great kind of technologies. You know, Miro is emerging as a great kind of platform for a big kind of open, it's almost like a big open world, a big open whiteboard world, you know, and you can kind of build whatever you want in there. You can keep it really open, or you can start to add structures and stuff in. You know, I've used it in lots of different ways to support sessions that I've been running. And I think it's, you know, it's great to have this as part of our toolkit.
Chris and I would definitely visit Whiteboard World.
Yeah.
Sounds like I'm kind of a something. All right, that's 5 minutes, team. Lots of great things in there. I'll go in and clean up just to make it a little bit more tidy. Miro, Tara is saying Miro is really great. Trialed it as a staff. How do we get it so kids don't have to sign in? Do we need a certain type of account? We can take some of those tangible bits, but when you're setting it for folks just to be contributing into it, it should just be a link. Am I right there, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you once you've created the board, the only challenge with that is that they come up as without their names on it. So one of the things you might want to think about is if you can create spaces where you can add names. Have we got time for like a 1-minute Miro lesson? A 30-second Miro lesson?
Let's do it.
The 30-second. All right, let's do a really quick 30-second Miro lesson. So let me just grab that and share that one. So one of the things you might think about is if you want because we haven't actually, people who've created accounts, we can see their names have appeared. I can't see, Jim Sill, he's there and Georgina's there. But what you might want to do is use it anonymously for students. But there are a couple of things you can do, is that you can do things like if you create a bunch of Post-it notes, it's the world's smallest Post-it note, and I'm just about to create a stupid thing on it as well. Ignore me.
Such a good tip. Love this.
I'm doing so well here. So what you might do is get a Post-it note, or you can go into this little templates bit and actually get a bunch of Post-it notes pre-made, a stickies pack, and just add that in. So add in a stickies pack, and bing, you have these. And what you'll see is on lots of on Post-it notes is the little luggage tag is visible. And as you click on that, you can actually tag Post-it notes. So you might say, Summer, you are Post-it note yellow tag. And what happens then is these, you can see here that these stickies are now actually tagged with students' names. So to help you to kind of keep an eye over things, I might tag this one. So all of the blue tags, I can just edit that and say, that is Tom. Done. And now Tom has his own little set of Post-it notes. And you can actually add multiple ones. So if kids were working, if Summer and Tom were working together, you could tag it Tom and Summer. And now I can see that they're working together. And that's the combination of their ideas. So you can use, even though it's anonymous, you can use sticky notes to do that. And the other bit, which we haven't done here, but you can imagine, is you would put in a frame, so a custom frame here, and this frame you could actually name, this is Sam's frame. This is where Sam's going to do her work. So you can actually create spaces within a Miro board for students to have their own learning space. So at the moment, I would always go for the anonymous thing, because then you don't need kids to log in. So in terms of privacy impact assessments, but I do know, and I don't want to say this just in case I get it wrong, but I'll say it because I always get things wrong, is I think the department is actually doing or nearly done the privacy impact assessment on Miro itself. So that's really great, because that would allow potentially the creation of accounts as well. He says comfortably, Miro in a minute. All right.
Thank you.
Are we good to move on?
I think so. I think we want to start to look at, all right, if there are proxies there and they are indicators, there's different signals that we have to be really aware of, because often they can kind of throw us some fakies when we're making judgments. Am I right there, Tom?
Yeah, I think so one of the things we grapple with is this idea of how do we know that learning is taking place? And so we're identifying some signals, and this is a nice way of kind of thinking about that analogy or metaphor, I can never remember which one, signals of learning growth. So what it is that is telling us that something is happening, that learning is taking place. And you can see the little hexagon there, the learner and the proxy. So sometimes in different scenarios, the signal is hidden to us, so it's hard to kind of pick up the signal. Sometimes that's really clear, the signal is really clear to us, and sometimes it's a bit messy, so it's scrambled, it's noisy, there's other things going on. And so, for example, you might have asked a student to create a set of slides or a presentation to represent what they've learned about a sequence of lessons. And actually what happens then is that their presentation skills sometimes get in the way of them sharing their understanding about a concept. And so the noise, when we talk about noise in that scenario, it's all of those other things that are potentially getting in the way. It might be their language, or it might be the technical skills, might be the access to technology. All of those things could potentially be getting in the way of them being able to give you a clear signal about their growth. And so that's what we want. When it's clear, we can really see the connection and alignment back to a clear learning intention. The other thing that's worth saying is that sometimes, given a really engaged session or time when students are learning, when they really care, and linking back to some of that emotional stuff that Summer has shared, we also get unintended outcomes. So sometimes things happen and there's a signal that we weren't expecting, and it's worth being able to have great strategies and frameworks to better capture some of those unintended outcomes from a particular learning experience. So the idea of a signal is something that we're looking for, like where are those signals, like being able to tune in really, really well to the right frequencies. What are the key signals for us in terms of learning growth?
And Tom, I think one of those that we miss so much, right? And this is where it comes down to a deliberate design of proxies, is one of the things we miss so much is body language, for example.
Yeah.
So it's so much harder, and students don't necessarily all put their cameras on, and I totally understand that. There was a really interesting article I read the other day about a lot of us are you must put your camera on to show me your interacting. In fact, it's not a great proxy, because I think there was that one where I should have set this up and done it properly, but there's that one where that young man just had a photo of himself printed out and just kind of held the photo and put it in front of his webcam, and he's not moving, and he was obviously off doing something else. But not only is it not a great proxy for learning and doesn't give us great signal, or gives us, I think, weaker signals through video now in lots of ways. The other thing is you don't kind of want to get into, like, lots of students don't want you to be in their house and to look into the space where they're at. So, insisting you put on, turn on video if you're having synchronous things is a really, it's worth reflecting on that and whether that's the right thing, and whether there's a cost value in terms of the value of the signal you actually get even. So what that forces us to do is, whereas in a classroom, I can, that kind of tingling spider sense of, things are going really well, or things aren't going so well, or this little group in the corner, there's something wrong there, or, that sense you get in face-to-face learning. It's so much harder in remote and flexible learning. So we need to design other ways and other proxies to get the information we need, and to make sure that those signals are really nice and strong, I think.
Yeah. So we need to be able to do something with the signal, don't we, though? I mean, this is the important part. We need to be able to, the signals coming to us clearly. For example, you might have had a go at creating a hexagonal thinking activity with your students. Maybe they're working on a separate slide. They've got the hexagons. They're having a go at building a couple of ideas and mapping them. It's like, what does that tell us or show us about their learning? So the signal is clearer because we've done a better job, or we've thought really carefully about what we're designing. But now it's a case of thinking to ourselves, what does this show us about this learner? What does the signal mean? And I think a good way of thinking about it is, obviously we're making sense. So it's all about sense making and seeking out meaning, and understanding that a signal is carrying something, and we've got to be able to unpack that, interpret that. And so that's the next thing we want to look at, is actually a framework for being able to decipher the code. If the code's coming to us clearly, we've got to be able to do something with it. And Chris, this is a structure that we've used a lot over the years, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think back in about 2003, I came across the structural observed learning outcomes when I visited New Zealand, actually. So I went on a 10-day study tour to New Zealand, which was awesome, and looked at this as a way of classifying learning, and the way of classifying learning outcomes, which I think you explain much better than I do. So I'm going to let you do that. But it was super popular and well known in New Zealand, but somehow doesn't get talked about. Everyone talks about Bloom's, and we'll maybe do a smackdown between Bloom's and Solo in a moment. Everyone talks about Bloom's, but not everyone talks about Solo. So Tom, take us through, what is Solo?
Yeah, so first of all, it's a taxonomy, and it's a process of learning. So we're thinking about what is a learner going through in terms of their understanding, or showing their understanding. Remember, what we're trying to do is decipher the signal. So what's happening for a learner? And we might think, okay, so we're able to see learning happening, but we might be asking the question, like, where are they on that journey? Where is a learner? And also, what can I do next? What can I do next to help them in terms of their next step? So the taxonomy, if we think about any taxonomy, a taxonomy is a way of classifying and identifying and organizing something. So we get a taxonomy of Australian birds is likely to help us to identify Australian birds accurately. And what we have here is a taxonomy of learning, and we're going to try to, what we can do to use it, how we use it, is to be able to identify learning that we see. So that you can see the acronym there, the structure, the observed learning outcome. And for us, when we say learning outcome, we're thinking about the signals that we're creating, those moments where we've kind of designed. We're seeing that hexagonal map maybe that our students have had a go at creating, and we can observe it, we can experience it. And what we're asking ourselves is, what does that actually mean? What does that signal mean? So maybe we can look at the next next slide, which gives us some of the different levels that we can zoom in on.
Alrighty. I'm always in charge of clicking, and it's a heavy responsibility, which I bear well. But I just there we go. Whew. All right, clicking away. We're doing okay.
So Chris, let's put this in a context, shall we, to help people understand. We often talk about what it's like to understand coral reef as an ecosystem. That's always a nice example. So yeah. Let's have a think about an outcome. So specifically, what's the kind of context here then?
So I think that the beauty for me about Solo is when you think about what learning is, and that idea of, we're taking information into our short-term memories, we're connecting it together, and that's such an important piece, right? It's how do you connect information into a schema? So when we really understand something deeply, either deeply or at a conceptual level, it means that we've got the right information connected in the right way. And what we're always looking for is evidence of that in the learning outcomes or the learning proxies. So let's if we took, for example, Actually, you know what? A really good example as well, Tom, is the difference, and it's hilarious. I'll just set this up for everyone. Is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. So really getting knowledge and wisdom is knowing a tomato is a fruit, but never putting it in a fruit salad. Thanks, Summer. I'm glad that's brilliant. I'm glad someone laughed at that.
I like how you said it was funny at the beginning.
Well, I just wanted to get everyone's expectations up. But let's take the learning outcome is, for example, I can explain the role of a coral reef as an ecosystem. So we're gonna shortly look at a kindergarten example. So let's look at maybe a year 11 or year 12 kind of geo-environmental studies example. And it works because it also works as a metaphor. So the learning intention is you can explain how a coral system works as an ecosystem.
Okay. So the first part, or the first level within the cellular taxonomy, is the pre-structural level. And so often this is before a student is able yet to sort of show what they're able to understand. Maybe they haven't yet been able to kind of develop some ideas that are relevant within the particular topic. What would that be if you're trying to learn about the ecosystem of coral reef, Chris?
So in my both actual learning outcome or learning proxy and also my metaphor, it's like you're on the boat. So remember when we used to be able to go to the Great Barrier Reef? You're on the boat and you can look over the side and you can see kind of shapes and colors, but you can't really yet see the coral reef. So you're not even quite sure what it is yet. And that's really at that pre-structural bit. And what I love about pre-structural, and I know that Jim, this was his keynote to the New Hampshireites yesterday, is all about that being a beginner's mindset. Is it doesn't mean like you don't know something. It's not a deficit model of like, oh, that's you don't know that thing. It's actually a model of you don't yet know it because it's your first experience of it. You're in a beginner's mindset to this thing. And it's actually really exciting because it means there is some learning to come.
So the next level is the unistructural level. So that one is when our students are able to show us one or very few basic ideas about the particular concept that you're learning or about the particular intention that you're learning. Potentially there's lots of support involved in that, and we're kind of making that appropriate to the student in terms of their need. And so that notice the language there as well, unistructural, pre-structural. So that's helpful to us to pay attention to the type of thinking that's going on. So one or very few ideas being shared. And so, Chris, you're peering into the depths now. Maybe are you able to tell me a bit more about the kind of coral?
So I've got my stinger suit on. I've got my mask on. I've now got in the water, and what I'm able to see is a coral. So like, oh, here's a coral. Now this is great. It's not everything I need to understand a coral reef as an ecosystem, but it's the start of okay. I've got a piece of information now, and I might notice that there are a couple of different kinds of coral at this point. So okay. It's not just I only notice one thing. But it's that I'm at a level where I'm not noticing lots of different things, and I need some support in that. So I need someone to point at the coral and go, "There's a coral."
There's another one. Yeah. Okay. So the next level is multi-structural. So, and you'll also pick up that there's this reference in the language and then labels to quantity, and that's certainly what I'm trying to help Chris to do, is to show me many ideas. And so multi-structural is about many ideas, being able to also share that in a kind of confident way, a little bit more coherent, and importantly, not yet able to link those ideas. And so they might be able to list them, bullet point them, collect them together, post them on Padlet, but not talk about maybe how those Padleted ideas are connected. And so look at the hexagons as well. So you imagine a student showing you, I know these three things about this concept. That might be a book that you're reading, or it might be about the coral reef, but they can't connect them. They can't bring them together.
So I'm in there and I can see there are different corals, and I can see that I've actually got, a brain coral, I've got a flat coral, I've got these different staghorn corals. I know so much about coral. All these different kinds of corals, but I'm also noticing things like, oh, you know what, there are some fish swimming about here as well. And I'm starting to see kind of the wider picture. And sometimes I often feel that, it's also about where's my camera? It's about the narrowness of the view. And it's like unistructural, quite a narrow view, but now I'm opening up a little bit through multistructural, but I haven't yet made the connection between the fish and the different coral and the temperature of the water.
Great. So so you've explained those first parts really well. And what happens now, we're moving into a much deeper level of understanding. And so within the solo taxonomy, the next level is relational. So we'll describe the outcome that we've observed as a relational structure. And so that's when these kind of connections are starting to be formed. I'm much more interested at this level for a student to show me what they know about the connections rather than the pieces. They've already shown me that. They already show me that they know the different relevant ideas about a concept. My questioning and my activities and what I'm asking them to kind of show and represent are the actual links between them. So a range of ideas are shared and they can kind of confidently talk about the relationships between them. So Chris, what would that look like if you were able to connect some of the ideas you know about the ecosystem?
So now I'm starting to see things like, I'm just doing a lot of hand signals today, things like Nemo, and Nemo is just swimming around, and Nemo's hiding out in the anemone. That's anemone. He's hiding out there and is protected by that anemone. That's not the right word, is it? I can never get this right.
Close. It's good.
It's close, right? So it is protected in there, and I start to make some connections like, oh, well, you know, these fish aren't just hanging about; they're actually living in this reef, and there's a connection between the animals that are living on the reef and the reef itself, which is also coral made up of animals, made up of all of these kind of things which are interconnected. So I'm starting to see how one thing might affect another thing, and that for me, I just want to make the point is, for me, is always where I start when I'm designing learning outcomes. I always start to think from what I want all of my students to get to is at least a relational understanding. That's where I want everyone to be. And that's where I would start to write. Often where I will start writing my learning outcome is from that piece. If I can explain how the animal life on a reef interacts with its environment.
Yeah. Great. So relational, remember, is all about relationships. And so simple questions about connections and links are going to help elicit some really great signals that a learner is at that particular level of understanding. The last level within the published, or certainly to the, within the solo taxonomy as we know it, is the extended abstract. And so we've kind of gone from just talking about the links within these individual ideas, we've branched out a little bit further. So we've extended our thinking, we've extended our connections to other things that we know, and we've also started to abstract something. So we're able to kind of zoom out a little bit and ask ourselves, like, what's going on here? What's the pattern we're seeing? Maybe we're starting to hypothesize a little bit as well. Maybe we're starting to kind of notice the rules or patterns. Just going to duck down a little bit because I get maybe we're noticing the patterns within it. So extended abstract is a much deeper level of conceptual understanding. And so we've gone from just talking about the relationships to linking out much, much further. And so, Chris, I would expect you to be able, at an extended abstract level, to link the kind of ecosystem that you're looking at to maybe something else. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Did I come back there? Because I just froze and fell out for a moment. So I'm here. I'm here. Yes. Awesome, thank you. So the extended abstract is when, okay, I understand the relationships on this particular coral reef, but am I able to do things like hypothesize about how what I see here might be affected by, for example, the change in water temperature, or what would happen if the anemone died, like because of the change in water temperature, like what would Nemo do? And then, or I might be able to take, so that's kind of working in that abstract hypothesis land. Or the other place is to be able to say, well, this ecosystem, which I understand in a reef, what does that look like in a rainforest? Are there parallels? Are they the same? Or what does a city look like if we consider it as an ecosystem? So I'm able to take the relational understanding of a concept and then expand it outwards to relate it to other big concepts, or to hypothesize what might happen within this. And one thing I love to do with students, if they're learning anything which is a system type thing, like an ecosystem, for example, or a food web. So often we'll relate that, and we do a lot of that in science, is we'll do a food web of how energy transfers through the food web. And then the question is, well, what would happen if you took krill out of the ocean, right? You remove krill out of the ocean. What's going to happen to that food web? And if I have an extended abstract understanding, I'm going to be able to hypothesize about my conceptual understanding. So really pushing students to that next level of conceptual understanding, going beyond just deep.
So do we have a quick look at something that's just the easiest way to use this?
Yes, we will.
I'm thinking about, one of the simplest resources that we all have is the ability to ask questions. And so, we can always invest in that. It's one of the cheapest and easiest things that we can do, design better questions. And so one of the ways that you might use the solar taxonomy is to create and design, carefully craft a specific question at each of the different levels. This particular example is taken from some work I've done with a kindergarten team over in Sydney, and they were working on looking at how the environment. This is one of the achievement standards for kindergarten, is they can suggest how the environment affects them and other living things. And what you can see on here is just a sequence of questions that progressively moves through the taxonomy. So tell me one of the seasons, obviously unistructural, all the way through to that relational level. So talking about causes, what causes some of the different, choose a season you prefer and explain why. So notice the language also that at each level, just as the Bloom's taxonomy often has verbs and language associated with it, it's the same with the solar taxonomy. And so a multi-structural question there, describe the different seasons, and an extended abstract question, maybe some reflection. How do things adapt? How do different countries and cultures respond? And also just another slide on, we've got another example of some of these things. So it's easy to build a sequence of questions, and it's one of the easiest ways that we can all start is to think, okay, what's a question that would be specifically at a relational level? So sorry, go on, you go, Chris.
I was just going to say, so we'll leave that example up there, but maybe in the chat, if anyone, I'm going to ask a question to see if we can get some people in the chat just telling us about their reflection on Solo. Is have you, well, some of you might have already used it, but this idea of how would you connect using Solo as a kind of lens to look at learning outcomes to something that you're going to do tomorrow. Now, don't worry if you think like, I still haven't quite got it, because if you want to, you could watch this back again because it's on YouTube and recorded, which is awesome. But the other thing is that we've also got this downloadable quick guide, which we'll put a link in the chat, which we put together to share with you, which kind of goes through this and give you some extra examples. But anyone in the chat can actually see Solo as something they would use, or is it maybe a little bit too new for them to think about right at this point? Thank you very much. A quick guide to solar taxonomy is in there.
And it makes me think, Chris, that when we're really hitting on that design principle for the online learning and pedagogies around that transparency, it's a really great tool around that transparency, meeting learners where they're at, and then building ambition into not only our learning design, but our assessment design as well, so that we can make those really solid, personalized professional judgments. So what I love is you've taken that parameter, you've taken that design principle and really put that into action around that assessment piece as well for any age of learner.
And can I just say that while it took me a while to get my head around solar, and I'm still doing it, by the way, I'm still getting my head around learning design, just in case anyone thinks we have it nailed. We're trying our best. And so I just really want to say that it is one of those tools that took me a while to get my head around, but is now the most important tool that's in my toolkit. It just, as we've got Michelle and Brad and Michelle again, and Kath and Erin, which is awesome. You've got a bunch of you coming in here with loads of ideas of learning ladders, cut from Cara and Phoebe teaching the big ideas in English. Like, it's just allowing us to really laser sharp focus on the quality of those learning outcomes. And there's a bunch like Stephen, I love that. Stephen, good to see you again. Using solar taxonomy to assist students in designing big inquiry questions. Absolutely. Give this over to students, give the language there. And we've actually got an example in a moment of potentially slightly more student-friendly language. But Tom, because I'm just checking out our time here, as ever, these hours, and they fly by. All right, so I've designed my proxy. So I thought, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to get students to create a short video on Flipgrid, which is going to explain their understanding of a concept of coral reefs, right? Just let's stick with that one for now. I know what I'm looking for is I totally know I'm looking for a relational understanding. I know what that will look like. So I know what signals I'm kind of looking for. And each of those videos, I'm now able to say, okay, Tom, that was a really multi-structural answer. You told me about lots of things, but at no point did you relate them together. Summer, however, you legend, have got an extended abstract. You've helped me to understand coral reef ecosystems by comparing them to a rainforest system, which we've already looked at previously. So I'm like, great. Now, the challenge is I've designed the proxy, I've got my signals, I've classified those signals. So what? Now what?
Well, now for feedback, I think we've got to talk about feedback because that's part of our experience. It's part of all of our experience, actually. I think I've invested a lot of time in just thinking about feedback, and because it's something that we all experience all of the time, and it's always going to help us, whether we're working with adults or working with students. And so imagine that we're in that kind of in the middle there. Our student we've classified the signal. We think we know where they are on that continuum or that process of learning. We think we've identified correctly where they are on the SOA taxonomy. Feedback in a few different ways is going to help them to move forwards, to reflect, and also to know generally where they're going. And so that idea of feeding back, looking back to what they've previously done, also feeding forward so they know what their next step is. Chris, you invented the term feed forward, didn't you? So
I did, yes. I'd like to disclaim that now on live stream.
I
did, in fact, in 2003, invent the term feed forward.
All right, good. I'm glad we've got that on the public record.
I do want to say, though, I did. No, I'm sure someone else much cleverer than me came up with that term, but it was such an important revelation for me to split feedback. Because often when I talk to people about feedback and feed forward, they say, oh, but I do that all in the feedback. But actually, cognitively for students, it's actually such a useful thing to be able to split your feedback from your feed forward. And I think that, I use loads of tools like WWWEBI, what went well, feedback, even better if, feed forward.
Mm-hmm. And the third one we might often, is feeding up. And so that's that concept of zooming out a little bit. And, thinking about what else, where is this going? Where are we kind of tracking? How are we kind of tracking in terms of our bigger goal? And so the idea of clear intentions, connecting back to those bigger intentions is a really important one. On the next slide, we've just got those 3 questions that we'll commonly see if we sort of think about feedback. So how am I going? So thinking about the progress so far. Where am I going? So what's the bigger intention here? What's the bigger goal? What's the learning intention? And then where to next? What's my next step? And I think it's just important for us to remember that it's all very well and good to identify a student on the taxonomy, but it's so important to help them know how to move forward, to continue to make progress and to continue to make growth. I think it's not just about identification, it's about momentum. And so how do we help that student move and keep going? Maybe that's a question that you're going to bring in from, maybe it's the next step, but it's so important for us to think about how do I keep them moving, to something that's appropriately challenging the next step for them.
And we've already shared these previously, but this idea of the growth ladder, and there are a bunch of them which we'll put in the chat, bit.ly/growth ladders, if you just want to jump on it yourself, but we'll put that in the chat. And they're built on the solar taxonomy, which I think I've mentioned previously, but we've never explored really what that means. And we've got a bunch of these growth ladders around capabilities like questioning, the Victorian curriculum, critical and creative thinking, subdomains. Like there's loads of them there for you to use in those learning conversations. They're written in the first person because they are really a student tool, but they also give you a lens to make some judgments. I've also got a bunch of these, by the way, which have written about content. I've got loads of these in French and looking at pronunciation and complexity of language. And I've worked with teams who have built these in mathematics. So the idea is really simply about making very visible that growth. So the feed up, allowing you to see where you're going, the feedback, looking at where you are, which are those kind of colored boxes, the gray, red, amber, and green boxes and here, and then the feed forward, we actually build some of it into these gray bricks here. So we'll say, if you're at a one, that's one thing I should have said is we simplified the language for students. So rather than pre-uni, multi-relational, extended abstract, we kind of changed it to ready, one, multi-connect, extend, and transform. But if I'm at a one level, I know how to form a question but can't yet classify it. Here's one thing I can do. So there's built feed forward into these growth ladders. So there is a tool for you. Jim has put them into the chat, so please feel free to use them with great impudence. But what we want to do just before, there's two things we're going to do before we get into our extra tools and kind of wrap things up. The first thing is that Tom has, I love this picture, Tom, and I know I made this thing yesterday. I made this gag about it yesterday. Tom's ebook is not a book, right? It's a PDF. So you can, it's free. You can get it from that link. But it does not look like that. That's not what's going to download into your inbox.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Come up with more strategy and crowdsource to zero.
I just don't want to build up people's expectations. But Tom has this brilliant book PDF, which I actually do have it printed, but I always flick through it because it's 55 strategies and they're just really powerful but super simple and I want to thank you for putting them all together, Tom. But what we're going to do is Tom has 55 ideas, but we reckon, because there's a good kind of massive bunch of you with us tonight, is that we can get more than 55 ideas. So what we're going to do is just for 4 minutes, and let me just... 3 minutes. What we're going to do is we're going to pop back onto the Miro. Let me just switch over my screen sharing. We're going to pop back onto the Miro. Go on.
A Miro smash on proxies of feedback. Feedback, feed forward, feed up. What are the tangible tools and strategies that you use for feedback, feed forward, and feed up? We're really interested in that. So if I asked you that same question, Tom, can you just give me one example of your favorite proxy for feed up?
It would probably be, that's a tough one. Feed up is an interesting one because it's all about intention, so long-term goal. So maybe what does success look like? And so what's surrounding students with great examples of outcomes. So that would be one of the ways I would kind of connect students with the long-term goal. Like, what does success look like? Nice.
Feed forward. Again, I might use some exemplars of, perhaps some essays that I know might be of a just below standard where I wanted that kind of, excellent peak standard, and see if together we could get there. So that might be an example as well. Also something for feedback in the way of how I'm going. I really always loved recording voice while I was doing my first edits of student work. And like, whoa, I've just opened this book, or I've just opened this PowerPoint. That's amazing. What I can really see is some great design work. I'm going to come back through and then have a look at what the learning looks like. So mine was always an audio recording on the day or the day after I received the task, to give them something that was quite instant.
And I would love people to really think about, especially in remote and flexible pedagogy, the kind of things that you're using, not just your structures for feedback, but also like one that Jim and I have used, which we were very excited about when we were doing some stuff in Google Slides, was MOTE, M-O-T-E, which is a voice, it's just what you're saying, Summer, it's a voice comments feedback. So the ability, and it's just great for accessibility as well, but the ability to kind of drop voice comments in. And my favorite feedback, because no one asked me, was I leant across to get my favorite book from the bookshelf, Ron Berger. I have such a huge just adoration of this.
Where is Austin now? Where is Austin?
Oh, who knows? But I'm sure a lot of you have seen Austin's Butterfly, which is a clip, which actually we could probably put down the link from because it's really useful to watch. But Ron Berger and the thing that I took away in terms of particularly feedback is be kind, be specific. Whose dog's that? It's not mine. Be kind, be specific, and be helpful. So kind but realistic. So when you're giving feedback, and this is so good for kids, be kind but realistic. Be specific on this, focusing on the small parts to make the whole thing better, and then be helpful. So actually give some feed forward, like think about doing this thing next. And that for me was such a powerful structure to build some feedback and feed forward in with students, and especially using things like sticky notes, using things like, I'm just going to stop the timer, using things like voice comments, using things like the 6 thinking hats, writers conference through Google Meet, immediate feedback during live teaching sessions, bump it up wall.
Oh,
I'm not
I like
sure what
that.
that is, but it sounds like the best thing ever. So whoever wrote bump it up wall, if you want to stick in the chat exactly what a bump it up wall is,
That one.
I'd love it. So
That's very-
so our time, I'm just going to switch back my little screen share. Our time is running out, but we always, what we want to do, Stephen, you and I need to go and get a coffee at some point, because we are just all three of us. In fact, Tom, I don't want to brag, but Tom and I met Ron last year, about a year ago, almost a year ago exactly, and we had dinner with him. Just saying. So we
Have to just say.
we love Rob Burger. We love Rob Burger. But what we're going to do is, just to kind of wrap up, is we always want to try and fill your cup. That's what we're here for. We're not here to lecture you. You're not here to be thought leaders around, we're here to be practical. We're here to fill your cup. So hopefully you've got, hang on. Sorry. I just need to stop for a moment.
Cool.
And so you could do that in a Padlet. You could do it in a Miro in flexible and remote learning. Alice, amazing. Thank you so much for that explanation.
Awesome, Alice. I'd love to see a photo of that on the Miro if you've got time as well.
That'd be so cool. So you've got the solo guide. We've got the 55 strategies and ideas to improve feedback. We've also got an unofficial parents guide. So it was just something that we put together, not officially from the department, but as educators. And also I have a horrible child who's learning at home. He's not horrible, he's beautiful. But we put together some kind of guidance for parents around how they can help their children make their learning visible. And that was really important. That was kind of our piece. So it's on the slides, which I'm about to put. I'll give you the link to those in a moment. So we've got the unofficial parents guide. Simini, the slides are coming in just a second. Do you want to talk to us about the Pivot Pulse survey, Sam?
Yeah, it's just from our friends at Pivot who have made it available. And this is just so you don't have to go through and find a lot of those survey items. So we know a lot of you are using SurveyMonkey or some others to get a bit of a temperature check of your school community. So they've got lots and lots of those survey items that you can just pull and pick and are ready to go. So that'll save you a bit of time and energy, all in Australian Voice, all they're aligned to teaching standards, etc. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. And next week I want to give you, please go on.
No, go on. I was just going to say it's all linked in the slides I'm just about to put into the chat. In fact, they're already in because there are already a bunch of people there. And that the Pivot survey is free to Victorian teachers at the moment.
Correct. Thank you for that.
Schools, yeah. No worries.
Yes. They're there in any way to help. And then next week, we wrap up our mini course by really looking at student agency and transitioning beyond, voice and making sure they're having a lovely time right into being partners in the learning process. So we've got Ren Gillett, and Ren is a former executive of VIC SRC, which is Victorian Schools' peak body and authority for student voice. She's been on interview panels. She has formed strategy. She's done all sorts of things. But importantly, we're really looking at how we can really bake that in and amplify student agency through great learning and through great teaching. So I'm really excited to look at that with Ren. We've got some pieces from our friends at Evidence for Learning and SBA in there as well. So that is going to be very much a moving you along, if I'm looking at the growth ladder nomenclature there, Chris, moving you along from just acknowledging students, maybe even embedding some student voice, to really looking at activating their role in learning. So very exciting next week, and I think a really good one to end on as well.
Absolutely, and just so that you know, we just pinged out the world's longest link. So Jim's going to shout at me for putting the long link in instead of the short link. But we've pinged out the world's longest link to the attendee slides, and on the attendee slides, you will see all of our slides from today. So to help you remember that, but also we have all of the resources from today linked in there on the resources slide, and also we have. Let me just click here. We also have the link farm from our previous 2 workshops as well. So this font is getting smaller because we're adding more stuff in there. And thank you, Jim, has put the direct link into that link farm as well. So everything is there for you, linked. It's usable. It's all free. It's all, we hope, really useful to you. Elaine McFarlane, what was the feed forward clue, please, Chris? What went well, even better if, I think was what we're talking about, yep. Elaine. Yeah, so what went well is feedback, even better if, feed forward. All right. Whew. What a day.
Thank you for joining us, Chris. I know you've had a huge day. I'd love to see Jim and Sam and Karen as well. So really good one to be thinking around the reimagining. It's not that we need to redesign assessment, but we really need to think about some of those variables and matching what we want with some of those tools as well. So we would love to be creating some more of those assets so that we can share things out widely. Karen, Sam, thoughts? Oh, and Kat. Hello, Kat.
Yes, this is my supervisor. She's just been making sure that you've got everything right about formative assessment. She was particularly interested in the solo taxonomy. So there you go. Thanks again, guys. What a great session. It was really, I love solo taxonomy. I learned about it last year when I was still in schools and teaching. And I love seeing practical applications, both for early years right up to our year 10, 11, 12 students. So thank you so much, Tom, for joining us, and Chris and Summer as well. And Jill for doing, Jill, my God, I'm tired. Jim for doing all of that back end work for us. Thank you so much. We do really appreciate it, and super excited with all the tools that people can take tomorrow to their class and put in practice. So thank you so much. We're really, really looking forward to next week to wrap up this deep dive with everybody who's come along. Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you. Are we doing the awkward wave, everyone? Well, Jim.
Yeah, awkward wave time.
Thank you. Thank you.